Chapter 8. Shattered, yet protected. After the wedding, my husband, his mother, and I moved into a two-story house my parents had prepared for us. It was a property they had owned for a few years, but my mother wanted us there so that once the marriage was firmly established, she could transfer the title to me. My father had initially suggested an apartment, but my mother insisted on a house, wanting me to have a larger share of the family's assets. Since there was another family that was already living in the house before us, my mother had the house renovated for months before we moved in. She put in two separate kitchens and bathrooms so that two families could live on the same second floor. The ground floor was occupied by a metalwork company, providing a steady rental income for our new family. My husband has lost his father when he was young and was raised by his mother and elder sister. I only learned later that they had been unfairly denied any inheritance because his mother had been the third wife. Though she was the only wife at the time of his death, the adult sons from previous marriages pushed them out. With no money or influence, they left their hometown without looking back. It was his sister who worked from a young age to support them, and they had all lived together with her family until our marriage. The first few months were nearly perfect. He was diligent at work, and I embraced the role of a newly wedded daughter in law. I found my mother in law to be a respectable, upright woman. In fact, I often felt a twinge of guilt because I found myself caring for her more than I ever had for my own mother. Despite her lack of formal education, she was wise and took immense pride in having raised a virtuous son in the face of poverty. I loved him, so I loved her too. Neither of them shared my faith, but they didn't object to my going to church. It was the life I had dreamed of, so satisfying, in fact, that I began to drift away from God. The distance between God and me grew slowly but surely. While my husband and my mother in law didn't forbid my faith, they didn't encourage it either. As a result, I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable about leaving them for church week by week. Sunday was also the day my husband's group of friends gathered at our house, a tradition his mother had encouraged since his youth to ensure her only son remained socialized. As the hostess, the responsibility for the meals and the gathering fell on me. If I went to church, my mother in law had to handle it all, which caused visible friction. Slowly, my attendance to the church dropped from every second week to once a month, until I finally replaced the service with a Christian radio program. Even then, the broadcast was often interrupted by my mother in law's calls for help. That was when the cracks began to appear. As my faith weakened, the perfect life I had built started to crumble, spurred by outside influences, specifically my sister in law. Unbeknownst to us, the matchmaker had promised my in laws that my family would grant any request they made. My sister in law's price for the marriage was a lease on the ground floor of my parents' building, but my parents would never have agreed to this. The space was already occupied by the Chinese restaurant. It had been sitting there for years, and they had no plan to move out. They still had the contract remaining, and therefore they had the right to stay there. My mother was also firmly against the landlord tenant relationship between our families, fearing it would lead to resentment. Last but not least, there was my father, whose violent temper was still uncontrollable. He had been trying to behave himself over the years, and he became better compared to his early days. But peace was still far from reach in our house. Yet we were able to manage to present our family as a normal family with no particular issue to most of our neighbors by that time. It would be hard for anyone from outside to notice our family's issue unless that person lived together with us in the same building. Since we had no desire to let my in laws learn about the truth of our family, my mother was completely against the idea. When her wish was denied, my sister in law began to hold a deep grudge. She spent every day slandering me and my family to my mother in law. Every morning, my mother in law would leave our house in high spirits to help her daughter at the food stall. Every evening, she returned cold and bitter. Even my sister in law's husband warned me that his wife's influence might eventually split us apart. I didn't understand what he meant the moment I heard that, so I didn't say anything. There was nothing I could do either, really, since I could not tell my mother in law not to go to her daughter's place. Even my husband could not. In fact, my husband also went to his sister's place on weekends whenever his friends were not barging into our house and helped her. To make matters worse, my own mother was overstepping. Just like my mother in law went to her daughter every day, my mother came to our house every day, literally. She did it out of goodwill, since she knew I was not familiar with house chores, including cooking. She did grocery shopping instead of me, came to our house, and did most of the house chores for me every single day. It was no doubt that she did it out of good intention, but she was overbearing, practically controlling what we ate and how we lived. To my mother in law, this looked like a wealthy woman boasting and bossing them around. I couldn't bring myself to tell my mother to stop. It was her only source of happiness. As a result, my mother in law was constantly being upset because of my mother's actions and because of what her daughter was telling her. This affected the relationship between me and my husband ultimately, because my husband loved and respected his mother so much. His number one priority in life was his mother, and that mother was getting upset constantly because of my family. The crack between me, my husband, and my mother in law was becoming bigger and bigger because of these two women, my sister in law and my mother. I was getting exhausted in between all these, as was my husband. Then, one day, my mother and my mother in law had a big argument finally. My mother in law argued that this was not what was promised before the marriage, and my mother argued back that she never made such a promise. My mother in law argued that we must pay more than other women because I was disabled, while her son was not. But my mother was adamant that we had already done more than enough. The argument was fierce, but the end was already set even before the argument. My parents had no intention to grant what my in laws wanted, and there was nothing they could do about it. Being terribly upset, my mother in law packed her things and moved back to her old house without a word a few days later. I realized I had to do something. I was pregnant already by this time. It was obvious that our marriage would not survive if this continued. Hoping perhaps things would get better if we lived far from both my mother and his sister, I carefully suggested to my husband moving to another city, the city where he grew up when he was young. He agreed with no difficulty, and thanks to my father, he could get a job at Hyundai in the city even before we moved in. My father's friend was one of the board members of the branch office in Hyundai in the city. We sold the two-story house we were living in until then and moved to the city within a month. I sincerely hoped that this would work out. I hoped our family would not be affected by my mother or my sister in law anymore, and maybe one day, perhaps after I gave birth to my child who was in my womb, we could bring my mother in law back to live with us once again. We couldn't suggest her living with us again at the time of our moving, because both she and my mother were upset towards each other quite badly. My mother considered my mother in law, along with my sister in law, greedy and was totally against the idea of her living with me again. My mother in law didn't want to live in the house, which was once again rented with my mother's money either. Thinking my mother was still ignoring her and bossing her around just because she was rich. There was nothing I or my husband could do but wait until they could calm themselves down. Things did not go the way I hoped. It rather went to the opposite, more exactly. My mother continued her daily visits despite the distance, and my husband continued to visit his sister and my mother every weekend. Those two women were still affecting our family, and apparently, my mother in law was still getting upset day by day. The crack in our family, between me and my husband especially, was just getting bigger and bigger. We never fought, since there was no issue when it came to just between us, but our surroundings were getting tougher and tougher. Then, after a month or so, I decided to go down with my husband and help my mother in law and sister in law on that particular weekend. I decided because there was a public holiday, Children's Day, on that weekend, and I knew they would be super busy with all the families going on picnics with their children. It was my effort trying to restore the relationship between my family and my in laws. I went down despite being already in the seventh month of my pregnancy and helped them with everything I had. I did it without letting my parents know, since they would certainly object if they heard their pregnant, disabled daughter worked all day. It appeared even my sister in law liked the fact that I was there to help her. I even felt proud of myself a little, feeling I did something good. Somehow, however, it was just me, apparently. At the end of the day, I went to say goodbye to my mother in law. My husband had stayed behind, planning to meet me at a cafe later. So I alone went, and there my mother in law, who was being upset all day for some reason, suddenly stabbed me with a word I never expected until that moment. You are not just a cripple in your body, but in your mind as well. All of a sudden, she threw that sentence in my face. I was frozen at first, could not understand what I just heard or why she was saying something like this to me. Even until now, I do not know why she was saying that to me on that day. Seconds later, tears wet my face even before I realized it. It was the most hurtful word I've ever heard in my entire life, no doubt. In tears, I left her house and went to the cafe where my husband was waiting. I told him what happened as I cried. He listened without a word. Then, at the end of my story, he didn't offer comfort. Instead, he stood up and barked, "Let's split up then." I was totally frozen for the second time. I didn't tell him all that because I wanted to divorce. I told him because it hurt me and I still wanted to keep my family. His response was something I never expected. The walk home was silent and cold. My sorrow turned to anger. I told him I would never forgive myself if I forgave his mother for what she said to me. He didn't exactly respond. Then, within less than a month, my husband suddenly quit his job without a word to me. It wasn't an easy job since it was a night shift. My father's friend told us ahead that he would have to do the night shift for the first few months, up to 1 year maximum. But he promised he would have him promoted to a better position in the company after that. Yet, for some reason, my husband chose to quit the job before those first few months ended. Only now, I guess his mother, and his sister as well, perhaps, didn't want him to do such a job anymore, since he quit almost right after he came back from his sister's place. I couldn't understand him, and my father was angry because he lost faith with his friend because of my husband's action. There was a real problem, though. We did not have any income now. Realizing that we were in a financially difficult position, my mother did not hesitate. She persuaded my angry father to buy an apartment with a shop in the city. My father agreed and proceeded. We once again moved our house and opened a small supermarket there. The work was hard, especially for me, a pregnant woman with a disability. The expected opening hours for a supermarket at the time in Korea were from 4 a.m. to 12 a.m. Yet we worked hard and tried to manage our lives once again.